My name is Gary, and I want to apologize for your experience.
Thank you for the apology.
There is a moment, and most of us have lived it at least once, where you walk into a room and you feel it before anyone says a single word. Nobody has to open their mouth. Nobody has to do anything dramatic or obvious or loud. It is just a look, a glance that lasts half a second too long, followed by a slow turning away, and in that silence, a message is delivered as clearly as if it had been written on a sign and held up right in front of your face. The message says, "You do not belong here. You are not what we were expecting. You are not enough." And on a Tuesday morning in the middle of an otherwise ordinary week in the fall, a woman named Eleanor Voss walked through a set of glass doors and received that exact message from 3 different people within the first 4 minutes of stepping inside. What those 3 people did not know, what none of them could have known in that fraction of a second when they sized her up and looked away, was that the woman they had just decided was not worth their time was about to become the most talked-about customer in the entire history of that dealership, and not in a way any of them would ever recover from. She walked in wearing sneakers, no makeup, a plain white tee, and jeans she had owned for 7 years. She was not trying to impress anyone. She never did. But the moment she stepped through those glass doors, 3 salespeople looked up, and every single one of them looked away. Not because they were occupied, not because a more important customer had just arrived. They looked up. They took her in from head to toe in less time than it takes to draw a breath, and they made a decision. And that decision, built entirely out of a worn pair of sneakers and the absence of visible wealth, would cost them everything. What happened inside that dealership over the next 40 minutes would end careers, go viral across the entire country, and force one very powerful woman to make a choice that nobody in that showroom ever saw coming. By the time she walked back out through those same glass doors, 4 employees had been let go, the owner was on the phone with his lawyer, and she had written a check that left the entire staff standing in stunned silence. Stay with me, because this is not a story about a car. It is not even really a story about a dealership. This is a story about something far older and far heavier than any of that. This is a story about assumption, the kind that lives in the chest, the kind people act on before their brain has finished a single thought. It is a story about dignity and what it quietly costs a person to move through a world that keeps finding new ways to tell them they are less than they are. And it is a story about what happens, genuinely, completely, and spectacularly, when the people who underestimate you finally discover exactly who they were standing across from this whole time. This is the story of Eleanor Voss, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end of it, you are going to feel something you did not expect to feel when you first pressed play. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, to understand any of what happened on that Tuesday morning, you have to go back. Not to the week before, not even to the year before. You have to go all the way back to a small town in southeastern Ohio, to a yellow house with a cracked front step and a screen door that never quite closed properly, and to a girl who learned something about this world before most children have learned how to tie their shoes. You have to go back to where Eleanor was built, because the woman who walked into Prestige Auto Group on a Tuesday morning in the fall did not arrive there by accident. She arrived there as the final result of 4 decades of being measured by people who had no idea what they were looking at, and 4 decades of quietly, patiently, methodically proving every single one of them wrong. Eleanor Voss was born in a town called Caldwell, Ohio, a place so small that the grocery store and the hardware store shared a parking lot, and everybody knew everybody's business before they knew their own. Her mother, Ruth, worked the early shift at a roadside diner called Patty's Place, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, pouring coffee for truck drivers and farmers, and the occasional traveler who had taken a wrong turn off the highway. Her father, Gerald, was around for the first 9 years of Eleanor's life, and then, quite simply, was not. He did not make a dramatic exit. He did not leave a note or cause a scene. He simply stopped coming home. And one morning, Eleanor woke up and her mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she did not have to say a word, because Eleanor already understood. Ruth Voss was not a woman who asked for help. She had grown up in the same town, in a family where need was something you managed quietly and kept behind closed doors, and she raised Eleanor with that same bone-deep sense of self-sufficiency. There was no extra money for anything that was not essential. Eleanor wore clothes from the church donation bin and felt no shame about it, because her mother had taught her, through example rather than lecture, that what a person wore and what a person was worth were two entirely separate conversations. By the time Eleanor was 11, she was helping her mother with the bills, not because Ruth asked her to, but because Eleanor had already begun keeping a notebook in which she tracked every dollar that came into the house and every dollar that went out, with the kind of precision that would have impressed a bank manager twice her age. She had an instinct for numbers that her fifth-grade teacher recognized early and tried to nurture, staying after school with Eleanor twice a week to work through problems that were years ahead of the regular curriculum. Eleanor absorbed everything. She was not the loudest student in any room she walked into. She did not raise her hand constantly or perform her intelligence for anyone. She simply sat and listened and understood things with a thoroughness that people would only recognize in retrospect, long after she had already used what she learned to build something they never expected. She won a partial scholarship to Ohio State at 18. Partial meant she covered the rest herself. A combination of waitressing, weekend tutoring, and a small freelance bookkeeping arrangement she set up with 3 local businesses near campus, keeping their accounts organized for a modest monthly fee that she negotiated herself. She graduated in 4 years with a degree in business administration and a minor in computer science, not because she had a grand plan, but because she was paying attention to which direction the world was moving, and she intended to move with it. She had no connections. She had no family money. She had no mentor in a corner office who saw potential in her and opened doors. What she had was a mind that never stopped working, a discipline that came from growing up in a house where waste was not an option, and a patience that people would consistently mistake for passivity right up until the moment she chose to act. She moved to Columbus after graduation and spent the first 3 years working for a mid-sized freight company, learning the logistics industry from the inside out, how cargo moved, where the inefficiencies lived, what the gaps were between what companies charged and what the work actually cost, and where a smart operator could build something better. She took notes. She asked questions that her supervisors sometimes found uncomfortable. She was passed over for a promotion once, and then a second time, and the second time she sat across from her manager in his glass-walled office and listened to him explain, with practiced reasonableness, that the role required someone with a certain level of presence, a certain way of commanding a room, and she nodded and thanked him for his time, and went home and wrote in her notebook for 2 hours straight, not about her feelings, about her plan. She started Voss Logistics Solutions out of her apartment in the summer, with a secondhand laptop, a prepaid phone that dropped calls on staircases, and $4,000 she had saved over 3 years of living as modestly as it was possible for a working adult to live in a mid-size American city. She had 2 clients in the first month, 4 in the third. By the end of the first year she had 12, and by the end of the second she had moved into a small office space and brought on her first employee, a woman named Diane, who had been laid off from the freight company Eleanor had left, and who would go on to become Eleanor's operations director and one of the only people Eleanor trusted completely. They worked side by side for 15 years, building something that started as a regional freight brokerage and grew, contract by contract, into a full-scale logistics company with partnerships across 3 national retail chains and annual revenue that would have been incomprehensible to the girl in Caldwell who used to track grocery bills in a spiral notebook. Eleanor never changed the way she dressed. This was a thing people noticed and remarked upon, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with a kind of low-level bewilderment, as if her refusal to upgrade her wardrobe proportionally with her bank account was itself a mystery to be solved. She owned a small number of high-quality pieces, a few blazers, a good coat, dress shoes she wore when a meeting genuinely called for them, but on most days, and on nearly all personal days, she wore jeans and a clean top and comfortable shoes, and she moved through the world in that uniform, with a complete absence of self-consciousness that people found either refreshing or confusing, depending on their own relationship with appearance. When a journalist asked her about it once, during an interview for a regional business magazine, She paused for a moment before answering. Then she said, "Money does not need to announce itself. Only insecurity does that." The journalist printed it, and it became, without Eleanor intending it to, something of a personal motto. She was 47 years old on the morning she decided to buy a new car. Her company vehicle, a black SUV she had driven for 6 years, had crossed 200,000 miles and was beginning to require the kind of attention that her schedule did not accommodate. Her assistant, a young man named Patrick who managed her calendar with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something, had been flagging the issue for nearly 2 months. Eleanor had been ignoring it with the same focused intensity because buying a car required going somewhere and spending time she preferred to spend working. But on that particular Monday evening, sitting in the parking lot of her office building at 8:30 at night, waiting for her engine to stop making a sound it had no business making, she finally conceded the point. She pulled up the websites of 3 dealerships on her phone, identified the model she wanted, a luxury SUV from a brand she had researched and respected, and found that Prestige Auto Group on Franklin Avenue carried it in both the trim levels she was considering. She would go in the morning. She would look at it, ask her questions, and decide. She did not call ahead. She did not tell Patrick. She did not change her plans in any way that would signal to the world that she was about to make a $200,000 purchase. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove home in a car that sounded like it was trying to tell her something. She arrived at Prestige Auto Group at 10:43 the following morning. She had stopped for coffee on the way and was still holding the paper cup when she pushed through the front doors. The showroom was exactly what she had expected. Polished concrete floors, track lighting positioned to make the cars look like sculptures, the faint manufactured smell of new leather and air freshener that all dealerships seemed to share regardless of brand. There were 3 customers visible on the floor, all of them accompanied by salespeople. There were 4 additional salespeople stationed at various points around the room, none of them actively occupied with anyone. Eleanor stood just inside the entrance for a moment, taking in the layout, identifying which vehicles were displayed where, locating the model she had come to see. Then she began walking toward it. The first salesperson was a young man, late 20s, seated at a desk near the entrance with his phone, face up in front of him. He looked up when Eleanor came through the door. The look lasted no more than 2 seconds. Then he looked back down at his phone. Eleanor kept walking. The second salesperson was a woman standing near a cluster of vehicles in the center of the room, apparently reviewing something on a tablet. She glanced over when Eleanor passed within 20 feet of her. Their eyes met briefly. The woman looked back at her tablet. Eleanor reached the vehicle she had come to see, a dark gray SUV positioned on a raised platform near the back of the showroom, price clearly displayed on the windshield in large white numbers, and she stood there. She read the information card on the dashboard. She walked around the vehicle slowly, looking at the exterior. She opened the driver's side door and looked inside. She stood there for 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because she checked her watch at the 2-minute mark and then again at the 4-minute mark, not out of impatience but out of the same habit of precise observation that had run through her entire life like a thread. Nobody came. Eleanor closed the car door and stood quietly for another 90 seconds. A couple across the room, both dressed in business casual, the man in a collared shirt and slacks, the woman in a blazer, were being attended to by 2 salespeople simultaneously, both of whom were speaking enthusiastically and gesturing toward a different model. Eleanor watched this for a moment. Then she walked toward a third salesperson, a man in his early 30s named Derek, according to the name tag on his lapel, who was standing near a support column with his arms loosely crossed, not visibly occupied with anything or anyone. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her. What Derek said next was not a greeting. It was not an offer of assistance. It was not the kind of opening line that any customer service training program in the country would have recognized as acceptable. Derek looked at Eleanor Voss, at her sneakers and her jeans and her paper coffee cup, and he said, with a smile that communicated something quite different from warmth, "Ma'am, just so you know, the vehicles on this floor start at $85,000. Is there something in a different range I might be able to point you toward?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She did not react visibly. She did not raise her voice or change her expression in any significant way. She said, very quietly and very clearly, "No, I am interested in the gray SUV over there, and I would like to know more about it." Derek nodded. He said, "Of course, absolutely," and then he turned and walked away. He did not go to get a brochure. He did not go to find a colleague who might help her. He simply moved to the other side of the room and did not come back. Eleanor stood where she was. She waited. She was, by her own later account, genuinely curious at this point, not primarily angry, not yet. Curious about whether this was going to correct itself, whether someone would appear and the moment would become merely an awkward pause in an otherwise normal transaction. She waited 6 more minutes. During those 6 minutes, 2 other customers entered the showroom. Both were men. Both were dressed in business attire. Both were approached by salespeople within 30 seconds of walking through the door. Eleanor watched this happen. She did not move. Then she walked to the reception desk near the front of the showroom and told the young woman seated there that she had been waiting for assistance for approximately 15 minutes and had not yet been helped. The receptionist smiled and said someone would be with her shortly. That was 11 minutes ago. That was when Eleanor Voss took her phone out of her tote bag and pressed record. She did not make a scene. She did not announce what she was doing. She simply recorded. She recorded herself standing next to the vehicle for another 8 minutes without anyone approaching her. She recorded the moment a third male customer entered the showroom and was immediately greeted by a salesperson who had been standing idle for the previous 12 minutes. She recorded herself walking back to the reception desk and asking a second time, and the receptionist's apology, and the subsequent 7 minutes in which still nobody appeared. She recorded everything with the stillness of someone who has spent their whole life paying attention. Then she walked out through the same glass doors she had entered through, got into her aging SUV, and drove back to her office. She did not say anything dramatic on the way out. She did not make eye contact with anyone on the floor. She simply left, quietly, the way she had arrived. That evening, she sat at her desk after everyone else had gone home and watched the footage she had recorded. She watched it twice. Then she opened her phone, typed a single sentence as a caption, "Went to buy a car today. I guess I wasn't dressed right," and posted the video. She did not tag the dealership. She did not use any particularly charged language. She did not call anyone names or make accusations or invite the world to react on her behalf. She posted the video and closed her phone and went back to the report she had been reading before she stopped to watch the footage. She had no particular expectation of what would happen next. The video had been viewed 112,000 which is perhaps why what did times. happen next By surprised 6 the even next her. Morning, it had crossed 1 million. By the time Eleanor arrived at her office at 8, and Patrick met her at the door with the expression of someone who has been awake since 3 in the morning, the number was climbing past 2.5 million, and her phone had received more notifications overnight than it had accumulated in the previous 6 months combined. The video had been shared by dozens of accounts with large followings. It had been picked up by news aggregators. It had been discussed in threads on multiple platforms where thousands of people were sharing their own versions of the same story, in dealerships, in jewelry stores, in hotel lobbies, in offices, in restaurants, at banks, a flood of accumulated experience pouring out from behind a door that one video had pushed open just far enough. The comments were extraordinary in their range and in their uniformity of feeling. Women in their 50s wrote about walking into dealerships alone and being talked down to or ignored, while their male relatives were sought out for the actual conversation. Women in their 60s described the specific and particular exhaustion of spending decades being assessed on site, the invisible tax of always having to prove something before a room would take you seriously. Women of every age and background described the exact expression, the 2-second glance followed by the deliberate turning away, that Eleanor's video had captured so precisely. Men wrote in too, many of them unsettled, many of them genuinely surprised, some of them with their own stories of being dismissed in rooms that had decided from the doorway that they were not the right kind of person. The story was resonating in a way that had nothing to do with cars or dealerships specifically, and everything to do with something much older and much more universal, the human experience of being reduced to your surface and found wanting by people who never bothered to look deeper. Prestige Auto Group became aware of the video on that first morning, when a manager arrived at work to find 17 missed calls from the dealership owner, Richard Holt, who had been alerted by a family member who had seen the footage shared in a neighborhood Facebook group the previous evening and had sent it to him with a brief message that he would later describe as one of the more alarming texts he had ever received. Holt watched the video and called an emergency meeting with his senior staff before the dealership opened. By noon, the communications team he had retained, the same firm that had managed a minor issue for them 2 years earlier involving a billing dispute that had briefly attracted local attention, had drafted a statement. The statement was released at 1:47 that afternoon. It read, in its entirety, "Prestige Auto Group holds all customers to the same standard of exceptional service, and we take all concerns regarding customer experience very seriously. We are currently reviewing the events described and are committed to ensuring every customer who walks through our doors is treated with the respect they deserve." There was no apology in it. There was no acknowledgement that what the video showed was wrong. There were no names. There was no commitment to any specific action. There was, most notably, no contact with Eleanor Voss. The statement lasted approximately 36 hours before the second wave arrived. A former employee of Prestige Auto Group, a woman named Sandra who had worked in the sales department for 2.5 years before leaving for a position at a competing dealership, gave an interview to a local news outlet that had been pursuing the story aggressively since the first morning. Sandra described, in specific and credible detail, a culture within the Prestige Auto Group sales floor that she said had been openly practiced and tacitly encouraged during her entire time there. Sales staff, she explained, were informally trained to read customers quickly upon entry and to prioritize their time accordingly. Customers who presented visible markers of wealth, certain vehicles in the lot, certain brands of clothing or accessories, certain behaviors like arriving with a partner or immediately picking up a brochure, received immediate and sustained attention. Customers who presented none of those markers were given what Sandra called the drift, a deliberate, practiced non-response designed to communicate that their presence was not a priority, with the expectation that customers who were not genuine buyers would eventually leave on their own, saving the sales staff from investing time in what the dealership culture described as dead ends. Sandra was careful to note that nobody had ever issued a written policy document or used explicitly discriminatory language in any training she had attended. The bias, she said, was environmental. It was ambient. It was a set of shared assumptions that operated like weather, always present, rarely discussed, treated as simply the way things were. She had felt uncomfortable with it from her first week. She had raised it once with a floor manager and been told, with practiced reasonableness, that sales was about reading people and that her instincts would develop with experience. She had not raised it again. She had left when the opportunity came, and she had carried the discomfort with her. Seeing Eleanor's video, she said, was like watching something she had witnessed dozens of times described back to her from the other side. Sandra's interview changed the public conversation in a significant way. What had begun as a viral moment, compelling and resonant, but potentially dismissible as a single incident, an outlier, a bad day in a generally decent place, became something with texture and context and systemic weight. The questions being asked in the comments and in the coverage shifted from what happened to Eleanor to what was happening generally, and to how many times it happened every day in places where no one was recording. The dealership's original statement, already regarded as inadequate, began to look not just insufficient, but deliberately evasive in a way that people found considerably more galling than an honest mistake. A second statement was drafted. It was not released, because before it could be finalized, something else happened. Something that nobody at Prestige Auto Group had anticipated, because nobody at Prestige Auto Group had done what they should have done from the first hour, picked up the phone and called Eleanor Voss. Eleanor, meanwhile, had spent the 4 days since the video went public continuing to go to work, continuing to run her company, and continuing to respond to the situation with the same measured patience that had characterized her response to the situation in the showroom itself. She had not given interviews. She had not posted any follow-up content. She had retained an attorney, not to pursue any specific legal action at that point, but because she was a businesswoman who understood that situations with this kind of momentum required counsel, and because she was beginning to form a larger plan that she had not yet shared with anyone. The plan had actually begun forming on the drive home from the dealership on the day of the original visit, somewhere on the stretch of Franklin Avenue between the dealership's parking lot and the on-ramp to the interstate, in the quiet of her car where she had spent a lifetime doing her clearest thinking. It was not a plan of revenge, Eleanor was not a person whose energy ran toward revenge. It was a plan of demonstration. There is a difference, and the difference matters. What almost no one knew at this point, what would not become public until the story had been circulating for nearly 2 weeks, was that Eleanor Voss had been to Prestige Auto Group once before. 8 months earlier, on a similarly ordinary morning, she had walked in wearing similarly casual clothes to look at a vehicle for Diane, who was also due for a company car replacement. She had received a nearly identical response, ignored upon entry, given the drift, eventually approached by a salesperson who steered the conversation almost immediately toward lower-priced inventory before Eleanor had asked a single question about budget. She had left without a word. On the drive back, she had called Diane and told her the story, and Diane had laughed in the exhausted way that women of a certain age and experience laugh at things that are not actually funny. Eleanor had made a note. She had said to Diane, "On that call, I am going to go back. I want to know if it is a bad day or a bad place. I will give it some time." Diane had said, "You are a strange person, you know that." Eleanor had said, "I know." 8 months later, she went back. And she had her answer. When this detail emerged publicly, through a source close to Eleanor, later confirmed by Eleanor herself in the interview that would become the second viral moment in this story, it reframed everything that had already been said about the incident. The visit was not a random encounter with an unfortunate customer service failure. It was the second data point in a deliberate inquiry. Eleanor had not gone to the dealership naively. She had gone with a hypothesis and come back with confirmation. And the response she was preparing was not a reaction to being insulted. It was the conclusion of a test that the dealership had failed twice, and the consequences it carried would be designed not just to address what had happened to her, but to make a point that outlasted her own story. The morning she returned to Prestige Auto Group, it was raining. She wore the same jeans, the same white top, the same sneakers. She carried the same tote bag. She had with her this time 3 other people: her attorney, a quiet man named Charles, who had worked with her for 11 years, and who communicated primarily through stillness and the occasional raised eyebrow; Diane, her operations director, who had cleared her calendar for the morning without being told why, and had simply appeared at Eleanor's office at 8:15 with 2 cups of coffee, and a 2-person crew from a digital media outlet that had reached out after the story broke, and whose editor Eleanor had spoken with twice on the phone and decided she trusted. She had not told anyone at the dealership she was coming. She pulled into the lot at 10:20 in the morning, in a rental car that Patrick had arranged because her own vehicle had finally been taken in for service. She sat in the parking lot for 2 minutes. Then she got out and walked toward the glass doors. The showroom went quiet when she walked in. There is simply no other way to describe it. Not the theatrical silence of a film scene, but the particular human quiet that happens when a room recognizes something it was not prepared for. Several salespeople looked up. One of them, a young woman Eleanor had not seen on her previous visits, took a step forward and then stopped, apparently uncertain whether to proceed. The floor manager, a man in his 40s named Gary, who had been with the dealership for 8 years and who had spent the previous 10 days in a state of professional dread, appeared from a back office within approximately 45 seconds of Eleanor entering the room. He was not wearing a jacket, and he put one on as he crossed the floor, which Eleanor noticed and which she would mention later as one of the details that made the morning real to her in a way that was almost funny. Gary extended his hand and said her name and said he was glad she had come in and that he wanted to personally apologize for her experience. Eleanor shook his hand. She thanked him for the apology. She said she appreciated it. She said she was there to buy a car. Gary, who had clearly been composing some version of this conversation in his head for days, began to speak about the model she had inquired about the trim options, about the current inventory. Eleanor let him speak. She listened with the same focused attention she had applied to everything in her life. She asked several questions that demonstrated a level of preparation that made it clear she had done her research and knew exactly what she wanted, and had known it before she walked in the first time, and the second time, and was only here now, at what was technically the third time, because she had a larger purpose than simply acquiring a vehicle. When the conversation reached the natural point where a decision was being requested, Eleanor looked at the gray SUV she had stood next to 18 days earlier and she said, "I will take 2. one for myself and one for my operations director." She pointed at Diane, who raised her coffee cup slightly in acknowledgement without expression. "Cash," Eleanor said. "Today." The check was for $228,000. Eleanor had calculated the precise amount the night before and had written it out at her kitchen table with the same deliberateness with which she had once calculated grocery bills as a child. She handed it to Gary directly, who held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment, in a way that said more than anything he could have put into words. The media crew filmed the transaction. They filmed the handshake. They filmed the moment Diane walked over and stood next to Eleanor with the dry, composed expression of someone who has been watching people underestimate her partner for 20 years and has developed a highly specific feeling about witnessing the end result. They filmed Derek, who had been pulled from the floor before Eleanor arrived, but who could be seen through a glass partition in a back office, standing with his arms at his sides, watching. Within 72 hours of that visit, Prestige Auto Group confirmed that 4 members of their sales staff had been separated from the company following an internal review of customer service practices. Derek was among them. The dealership did not provide the names. They issued a third statement, this one written by someone different from the previous 2. You could tell because it actually contained the word "sorry," stated plainly and without qualification, followed by a commitment to mandatory training on unconscious bias and customer service standards, a review of floor management practices, and a donation to a local workforce development organization. It was, in the opinion of most observers, 3 statements too late. But it existed. It was on record. It was a thing that had been forced into being by the specific and unmistakable clarity of a woman who had walked into a room twice in plain clothes, been dismissed twice, and returned a third time to make sure the lesson was one that nobody in that building would find it easy to forget. Eleanor gave one interview to the same media outlet whose crew had filmed the purchase. The interview was 45 minutes long and covered the incident, the culture Sandra had described, the 2-visit history, and the check. But the portion that traveled furthest, the portion that was clipped and shared and quoted in op-eds and morning show discussions and comment sections for weeks afterward, was the part near the end, when the interviewer asked Eleanor what she wanted people to take away from the story. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want people to understand that I was able to come back with a camera and a checkbook. I had the luxury of making a point. Most people do not have that. Most people walk into that same room and get the same treatment, and they drive home, and they feel small, and they do not have the resources or the platform to turn it into a story that anybody hears. I am not interested in being exceptional in this situation. I am interested in the situation being different." And then she mentioned the program. The Voss Foundation had existed for 3 years at this point, focused primarily on scholarship funding for first-generation college students from low-income households in Ohio and Pennsylvania. 6 weeks after the dealership incident, Eleanor announced a new initiative within the foundation, a professional development and placement program specifically for women from low-income backgrounds pursuing careers in sales, retail management, and business development. The program would provide mentorship, professional skills training, negotiation coaching, and placement support with partner organizations that had committed to the program's standards. The stated purpose, in the press release, was straightforward: to ensure that the next generation of women who walk into rooms do not have to build a company first in order to be taken seriously. The funding for the first year of the program was considerable. Eleanor had also quietly reached out to 3 other luxury dealerships in the region about becoming partner employers. 2 had responded within a week. Sandra, the former employee who had given the interview, was offered a position as an early advisor to the foundation's new program. She accepted. Diane ran the operational setup of the program for the first 6 months, before Eleanor brought in a dedicated director. Derek and the 3 other former Prestige Auto Group employees were not publicly named in any of the foundation materials, which Eleanor considered unnecessary. The point had been made. The point was on record, in a video that had been viewed 43 million times by the time the foundation program launched. The point did not require additional emphasis from her. Richard Holt, the dealership owner, gave a brief statement to a local newspaper in which he said the incident had been a turning point for his organization and that he was committed to a different culture going forward. He did not request a meeting with Eleanor. He did not call her. she did not call him. There is a kind of dignity in knowing what does not require your further attention, and Eleanor had always been very clear about what fell into that category. She picked up her 2 vehicles on a Thursday morning, driving them off the lot with Diane in the second one, and by 11, they were back at the office, and Patrick was meeting them in the parking lot with his clipboard and his relentless focused energy, and no visible acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened, which was one of the things Eleanor valued most about him. She went back to her desk. She had a call at noon, and a board meeting at 3, and a flight to Houston the following morning for a client meeting she had been preparing for since September. Life, as it always does, had simply continued running alongside the story, indifferent to it, requiring her attention in the ways it had always required her attention. She gave it that attention. She always had. The story of Eleanor Voss stayed in the public conversation for longer than most stories of its kind tend to stay, which is to say longer than 2 weeks and shorter than a year, which is about as much as the modern news cycle extends to anything that does not involve criminal proceedings. It was discussed in business schools as a case study in unconscious bias in sales environments. It was referenced in customer service training programs at several large retail organizations. It was mentioned in a keynote address at a national women's leadership conference, where the speaker used it as a frame for a broader conversation about the invisible cost of assumption on the people it is applied to. Eleanor did not attend the conference. She sent a brief written statement that was read aloud. What it left behind, more than the discussion and the training programs and the conference keynotes, was something simpler and harder to quantify. It left behind the image of a woman in a white tee and worn jeans standing next to a $110,000 car, waiting with perfect patience for a room to decide whether she was worth talking to. It left behind the fact that the room made the wrong choice. And it left behind the demonstration, quiet and precise and impossible to argue with, of what a person can accomplish when they have spent 40 years learning to wait for exactly the right moment to act. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to really sit with it, because I think this story is worth more than just watching. How many times have you walked into a room and felt that look? How many times have you been sized up in a second and found wanting, not because of anything you did or said, but because of what you looked like, or where you came from, or what you were wearing that day? And how many times did you just absorb it, quietly, the way Eleanor absorbed it? Not because you had no feelings about it, but because you had learned, somewhere along the way, that the room was not going to change just because you pushed back. Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. I read every single comment on this channel, and I want to know your story. Tell me where you are watching from too. This community reaches places I never expected, and it matters to me to know where you all are. Was justice served here? I think most people would say yes, at least partially. 4 people lost their jobs. An organization was forced to change. A foundation program was built that will outlast the news cycle by decades. Eleanor Voss drove off that lot in 2 cars she paid for in cash and went back to running a company that had survived and grown for 20 years on the same qualities the dealership floor refused to recognize in her. That feels, on balance, like something. But I keep returning to what Eleanor said in that interview, about the people who do not get to come back with a camera, about the everyday version of this story, the version that plays out silently thousands of times a day in places where nobody is recording and nothing goes viral, and the person who was dismissed just quietly absorbs it and moves on, carrying it with them the way you carry things that never quite heal. That version of the story does not have a resolution. It does not have a check or a foundation or a viral moment or 4 people let go. It just has a person who walked into a room and was told, without words, that they were not enough. And then it has that person driving home. That is the story I want to leave you with. Not because I want to end on something heavy, but because I think Eleanor Voss would want you to leave this video thinking about those people. Not about her. She has always been very clear about that. She is not interested in being the exception. She is interested in the situation being different. And different situations do not get built by viral moments alone. They get built by the accumulated weight of people deciding to see each other more clearly. In showrooms, in lobbies, in offices, in every room where a human being walks through a door hoping to be taken seriously. That is the work. It is slow work. It is not always visible, but it is the only kind that actually lasts. Eleanor Voss walked in wearing sneakers, no makeup, a plain white tee, and jeans she had owned for 7 years. She was not trying to impress anyone. She never had to. And when the room finally understood that, on the third visit, too late to matter the way it should have mattered the first time, she collected what she came for, drove back to her life, and kept building the thing she had always been building. Quietly, methodically, with more patience than any room had ever deserved from her. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something you have carried, or someone you know, or a moment you have never quite been able to shake, then please share it. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe to Echoes of Tales. Until then, remember this: the room does not decide your worth. It never did. You walked in before they looked up. You will walk out long after they are gone.